On the afternoon of June 29, 2026, 5 days after Venezuela's twin earthquakes, a Costa Rican Red Cross rescuer named Alan Madrigal pressed his listening microphone against the rubble of the collapsed Galerias Playa Grande shopping center in Catia La Mar. The exchange that followed has been shared around the world. Is there anyone alive? Yes. Are you trapped? No, I'm free. The voice belonged to Hernán Gil Flores, a 43-year-old security guard who had been in the underground parking lot of that building when the earthquake struck on the evening of June 24th. Above him, 140 tons of collapsed concrete. Below him, the remains of his security booth, which had partially survived the 9-story building's collapse and created a pocket of air in which he was alive. 5 days had passed since the earthquakes. He had not had water in 5 days. He had not known until that moment whether anyone was coming. From that point, rescuers threaded a hose through the rubble and gave him water. They installed a tube to replenish the air in his void. And then they began the most technically complex extraction any of them had ever attempted. It took 70 more hours to get him out. At 9:20 in the morning on July 2nd, 8 days and 192 hours after the earthquake struck, Hernán Gil was carried out of the rubble of the Galerias Playa Grande shopping center on a stretcher, conscious, oriented, with stable vital signs, and according to the Venezuelan Red Cross paramedic who assisted him, collaborating throughout the ambulance ride. His injuries were relatively minor: a dislocated collarbone, a scalp bruise, and mild lung compression. He was transferred to Hospital de Clínicas Caracas. The UN's disaster assessment coordinator on the ground in Venezuela, Sebastián Mocorquer, had said the day before Gil was extracted, "Only miraculous rescues have been achieved 7 days after an earthquake." The standard framework used by every major search and rescue organization on Earth calls the first 72 hours the golden window, the period within which the statistical probability of finding survivors is highest, and after which the chance of finding anyone alive diminishes sharply with each passing day. Hernán Gil had been trapped for 192 hours when they got him out. He is, by the framework that defines this work, a scientific anomaly. To understand what Gil's survival means, you first have to understand what Venezuela looked like at the moment he was found. The twin earthquakes of June 24th killed at least 2,295 people as of the July 2nd rescue, with more than 50,000 people still unaccounted for. Across La Guaira, the coastal state immediately north of Caracas that bore the brunt of the disaster, approximately 58,000 to 60,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. By the time rescuers made contact with Gil on June 29th, the disaster had shifted from active rescue to recovery. Most collapsed buildings in La Guaira had been marked D for deceased, after searches found no signs of life. "Time isn't wasted in a place where there is no expectation of recovering people alive," said Javier Rhodes, coordinator of the Spanish rescue team. That was the context in which 7 countries and more than 100 specialists were simultaneously working to extract one man from under 140 tons of concrete that had been unstable for 5 days. Hernán Gil had been on his night shift at the Galerias Playa Grande on the evening of June 24th when the earthquake struck. The shopping center sustained a catastrophic failure as the twin events, 39 seconds apart, collapsed the building above him. His security booth, a small reinforced structure inside the parking lot, did not fully survive the collapse. But it survived enough. The steel frame and partial ceiling of the booth deflected the weight of the falling concrete in a way that preserved a small volume of air around Gil. He was not physically crushed by the material above him. The concrete and debris came to rest around and above the booth in a configuration that left him able to move. Uncomfortable because of the rocks, he told a rescuer, but not physically trapped. That distinction is what changed the biological calculus of everything that followed. When muscles are compressed continuously by rubble or debris, the tissue breaks down and releases proteins and electrolytes into the bloodstream. The kidneys, overwhelmed by this material, can fail, a condition called crush syndrome that develops within 12 to 72 hours of significant compression. It is one of the leading causes of death among people who are successfully extracted from collapsed buildings after long periods. Hernán Gil did not develop significant crush syndrome because his muscles were not significantly compressed. The security booth structure had protected him from the weight above. His injuries on extraction, a dislocated collarbone, a scalp bruise, minor lung compression, reflect someone who had been displaced and bumped by falling material, not buried under it. The second factor was air. In a sealed void, carbon dioxide accumulates as a trapped person breathes. CO2 concentrations that would be harmless outdoors can become incapacitating within hours in an enclosed space with no ventilation. Hernán Gil's void was not hermetically sealed. The rubble around and above the booth contained enough gaps and passages to allow some replenishment of air from the larger debris field. The third factor was temperature. Underground environments maintain relatively stable temperatures compared to the surface. Gil's position 9 meters below the surface insulated him from peak summer heat, reducing his body's water demand and slowing dehydration. The fourth factor was the one he articulated himself. In an interview with TVV Network after his rescue, Hernán Gil described his experience underground. "I was praying a lot, asking God, and mostly thinking about my family, my children, my wife. So many things ran through my mind, but I always stayed calm. That calmness is not a minor detail in the survival equation. A person at rest, with a controlled breathing rate and minimal movement, consumes significantly less oxygen and loses significantly less water per hour than a person who is panicking, struggling, or physically exerting themselves. The difference across 5 days is not marginal. It is a measure that can mean the difference between being alive and not." The fifth factor arrived on day 5, when Alan Madrigal heard his voice and rescuers threaded a hose through the debris. From that point, Gil had water. Before that point, he had survived approximately 5 days without it, at the outer physiological limit of what the human body can tolerate in temperate, stable conditions. The combination of those 5 factors, no crush injury, adequate ventilation, temperature stability, psychological calm, and ultimately water supply, is what the scientific record on long-term earthquake survival consistently identifies in outlier cases. Haiti 2010, a 16-year-old girl found alive after 15 days. Japan 2011, an 80-year-old grandmother after 9 days. Turkey 2023, a survivor extracted after 11 days. In each case, the same combination: structural protection, air access, limited compression, and psychological composure. The golden window is not a biological wall. It is a probability curve, and in the right conditions, it can be extended far beyond what the average collapse scenario produces. The rescue itself was not easy. Multiple buildings around the Galerias Playa Grande had been damaged and were leaning into the target structure. Every aftershock, and there had been more than 130 since the June 24th events, introduced new instability into a structure that rescuers were already working to shore up around the extraction tunnel. Manny Sampang, a task force leader from the Los Angeles County Fire Department, told CBS News during the operation, "I have multiple buildings leaning into that building that we are trying to rescue him from." El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele wrote that, "The aftershocks have made this one of the most difficult rescues we have ever faced." When Gil was carried out at 9:20 a.m. on July 2nd, Bukele posted the footage to social media. "We finally managed to rescue Hernán." Venezuelan acting President Delcy Rodriguez declared, "Today, we celebrate the life of Hernán Gil." Guspimar Gonzalez, Gil's wife, said she had spent days of great sorrow believing he was dead. When she found out he was alive, she described it as a ray of sunshine. Gil had asked rescuers not to tell her until they were certain they could extract him. 50,000 people across Venezuela are still unaccounted for. The buildings marked with D and La Guaira were marked on the assumption that the survival window was closed. Hernán Gil's rescue on day 8 challenges that assumption, not by overturning the statistics, but by demonstrating what the statistics always contained, that in the right structural and physiological conditions, the window does not close when the clock says it should. There are 3 implications that researchers and responders will carry forward from this rescue. The first is the structural void factor. Gil's survival was made possible more than anything else by the partial survival of the security booth structure. That structure was not reinforced concrete designed to survive a collapse. It was a small, incidental feature of the parking lot. But its geometry and materials created the one condition that matters most in extended survival: a protected space in which the body can exist without being compressed. What that tells engineers is that void space distribution within collapsed structures is not random, and that mapping it more precisely could help prioritize where to look when the 72-hour window is closing. The second is the psychology of waiting. The 70 hours that the international team spent extracting Gil after making contact on June 29th were hours in which he remained conscious, calm, and communicative throughout. His ability to sustain composure throughout, despite longer waits, aftershocks, and pauses in the operation, is a documented survival asset. Emergency medicine increasingly recognizes that the psychological state of a survivor is not separate from their physiological state. Gil's calm was part of his survival, and it was also part of his rescue. The third is what Gil himself said from the hospital about the 50,000 still missing. "Keep searching," he said. "Keep hoping that you can find your family members alive and well." He said this as someone who knew what 8 days in a structural void felt like. He said it to the families who are still waiting for a voice from the rubble. The question of how many others like him might still be in those 58,000 damaged buildings. In structural voids, with some access to air having managed to stay calm, is one that rescue coordinators are now explicitly asking. The 72-hour window is a statistical center of gravity, not a finish line. Hernán Gil is the proof. Subscribe to stay ahead of what's coming.